Hello and welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Donicic. Like, comment, and subscribe. Let's get right into our main story today, which is concerning, you guessed it, Ukraine. Okay, just kidding. Actually, I'm not. Our story is relatively concerning Ukraine. However, we are going to focus on the concept of what is known as shuttle diplomacy. Now, the reason that we're concentrating on this concept is we're using the Russo-Ukrainian crisis as an example of how shuttle diplomacy is done. Now, basically, the example that we're going to utilize are the acts of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, Olaf Scholz yesterday met with U.S. President Joe Biden. On the February 14th and February 15th, he will be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky separately. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has met with Vladimir Putin yesterday and today has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, basically, this is shuttle diplomacy. When third-party neutral actors that are not directly involved in a conflict go around to each conflicting party and act as an informal arbitrator. Now, shuttle diplomacy was coined and kind of invented as a term by old diplomat, Secretary of State, philosopher, political scientist, and generally considered one of the most prevalent people in modern-day history, Henry Kissinger, during negotiations and mediation to settle the Yom Kippur War. Now, the reason that it was called shuttle diplomacy is Henry Kissinger and his diplomatic staff got out of an airport, entered an airport shuttle, went to go meet one world leader, and then entered that shuttle again to meet another world leader, and we're jumping back and forth between location A and location B, between party 1 and party 2, constantly through an airplane shuttle. Now, the reality is that these shuttles are probably no longer used, and the reality now is that shuttle diplomacy is carried out with airplanes themselves, with foreign leaders from different countries, third-party countries, having to travel between the conflicting nations. Now, I need to state right now that the example of Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz is not perfect when it comes to shuttle diplomacy. For something to be perfect shuttle diplomacy, the actors carrying it out have to be almost perfectly neutral or relatively neutral. Now, the reality is that Germany and France are not neutral. This conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not just a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is a conflict with Russia and the United States and NATO and Europe and the Western world. France and Germany are key actors in Western Europe, and they have taken a very open stance of supporting the United States and the NATO line. Now, just to reiterate what is causing this conflict, and we've covered it a million times. If you go on our Europe playlist, you'll see at least 10 videos there made in the last couple weeks. Now, what is causing this is the buildup of more than 100,000 soldiers in Russia and Belarus on Ukraine's border, prompting many people to believe that Russia is planning an invasion of Ukraine. Russia denies this, states that it doesn't want to go to war with Ukraine, states that that's not going to happen, and has instead demanded that NATO, 1, permanently ban Ukraine from entering the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 2, remove all soldiers and military assets from Eastern Europe, and 3, there's also another one, prevent any former Soviet republics from joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO and the United States and its Western allies have obviously stated that this is a non-starter and it will not happen. But let's just cover really quick why Vladimir Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. The reality is Article 5 of the NATO Convention states that any attack on one member state is an attack on all member states. And in the eyes of international law, every single signatory state to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is legally obligated to intervene on behalf of any state that is in war with another state or actor. Now, it's not that Vladimir Putin wants to attack Ukraine and is afraid that this would prompt all of the West from attacking Russia. The reality is that Ukraine could theoretically join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And after Ukraine joins NATO, it can begin a military experiment and a military advance to take back annexed Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, and to attack the pro-Russian separatists in the eastern Donbass region. This would cause a war with Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. But if Ukraine was in NATO, every single NATO ally would be legally obligated to get involved in the conflict and fight with Ukraine. So it wouldn't just be a war between Ukraine and Russia, it would be a war between Ukraine, the United States, France, Germany, Turkey, every European country that is a signatory of NATO, every other nation that's a signatory of NATO, and Russia, and also Russia's own security organization, the CSTO. It would be a world war. And Vladimir Putin has stated, I don't know why no one think of this. No one is concerned about this. People are concerned about this. And people have given this situation extensive thought. And that is actually why NATO has not been invited to, Ukraine has not been invited to join NATO, and it probably will not be. Now, Joe Biden and the leaders of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization have no ambitions to admitting Ukraine into NATO because fundamentally the nation is too problematic. Besides just the fact that Ukraine can attack Crimea and bring the entire world and the entire NATO pact into a war with Russia, Ukraine, as a country, politically speaking, has a very high level of corruption, a lack of transparency. Its military is not as well organized as the West would prefer. Its economic situation is not as advanced as it should be to be a NATO member state. There are a lot of factors that simply prevent Ukraine from being a potential NATO member. Now, that will not be happening. So let's just go into the final aspects of what is occurring to kind of prevent this conflict from transpiring and getting worse. Now, as mentioned, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, has had meetings with Joe Biden and will soon be meeting with the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. Now, Emmanuel Macron has had a meeting with Vladimir Putin and will be meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, very soon. Now, this shuttle diplomacy is occurring to take sides that kind of don't want to meet with each other right now. Now, the United States is not opposed to meeting with Russia, but Russia is definitely opposed to meeting with Ukraine and vice versa. Thus, a third party needs to be utilized to create a conversation. Now, one final thing that needs to be stated that is extremely interesting about Emmanuel Macron's visit with Vladimir Putin, which was very true. Macron stated that the level of diplomacy and the method of diplomacy to resolve this issue that has been occurring, the Russo-Ukrainian crisis, has been writing letters with demands and formal responses. Macron has stated that this is simply far too public, that this information is available to anyone, and that the diplomatic efforts of world leaders have been completely subjugated to public opinion. Now, I'm not saying that democracy is bad and that the public should have zero influence on what politicians are doing, but when it comes to international relations and diplomacy, that is something that is much more complex, dynamic, and difficult to understand than internal and domestic politics. Diplomacy is more effectively carried out when the public doesn't know anything about it. And this entire crisis has been extremely public, with exact responses being publicly leaked, the public knowing exactly what's going on, and all of this information just being available. That is not how diplomacy is done. And if this situation is going to be properly resolved, it is going to have to be done so in a private manner where world leaders meet privately, do not issue written statements that can be leaked to the press, and every single nation's concerns can be addressed. Now, then, it will be possible to create a diplomatic solution to the problem that is going on. Once again, I'm your host, Dennis Donicic. Let me know what you think about what's going on with the Russo-Ukraine crisis. Let me know if you think the attempts at shuttle diplomacy by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron will be effective. Let me know in the comments section. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you tomorrow.